Responding to its declining population, China did recently put a hold to the one-child policy that was enacted in the 80s as a population growth tool.
China is huge, the kind of huge that's hard to wrap your head around. Beginning in the 1950s, its population exploded from an already respectable 500 million to almost 3 times that today, which makes it bigger than all of North America, Australia, and Europe combined. Its consistent economic growth has made it one of the world's great powers, with enough military might to claim the strategically important South China Sea, and enough influence to begin the most ambitious infrastructure project in history, a $1 trillion network of ports, pipelines, and railroads across 65 countries. But none of this was inevitable. While China rapidly and forcefully industrialized, it faced massive famine and housing shortages. Its economy needed time to develop, and the world deeply feared overpopulation. China's response was the famous one-child policy, which limited ethnic Chinese families to a single child, with a few exceptions.
With the death of Mao in 1976 and the disastrous fallout of both the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, China's new government under Deng Xiaoping was eager to pivot away from the perpetual revolution of their forebears and move towards stability and economic improvement. China hoped to achieve rapid economic growth in the coming years, aiming to raise China's per capita GDP from around $250 to $1,000 by the year 2000. The CCP believed that China's rapidly rising population was an obstacle to this and committed itself to controlling it. Their solution was the infamous one-child policy that restricted the number of children a couple could have. The one-child policy was not a single law, but a general policy guideline issued by the CCP and enforced by various local and provincial governments. A letter from the CCP's Central Committee issued on September 25, 1980, which explained the need to control population to avoid economic collapse in the near future, is usually pointed to as the beginning of the policy. The policy was revised and reinforced several times over the years, such as in the creatively titled Document No. 7 in April 1984 and Document No. 13 in May 1986. But local governments had some leeway in how they handled the implementation of these guidelines. Broadly speaking, Chinese couples were limited to one single child. They could apply for permission to have a second under certain circumstances, such as when the first was disabled, and eventually rural families were permitted a second child if their first was a girl.
As nations develop, they choose to have drastically fewer children. China's problem isn't unique. About half the world lives in a country that is or soon will be in the same position. But it is uniquely big, and the timing uniquely bad. The story of China in the 21st century is just as much about demographics as it is GDP, military power, and the rule of Xi Jinping, all of which will be seriously tested by the coming demographic crisis.
The country had imposed one of the most extreme state birth control policies in the year 1980 to tackle its growing population. As part of the one-child policy, families with more than a single child were penalized. Women were forced to undergo sterilization. The policy also led to a rise in female feticide, especially in rural areas. Other criticism of policy included that it was not evenly implemented across China.
For decades, China's one-child policy was brutally enforced, with millions of involuntary sterilizations and abortions. It was not only cruel, it was a disaster.
From the 1980s until 2016, millions of women were subject to fines and even forced abortion and sterilization after having one child. In 2014, celebrity film director Zhang Yimou was fined more than $1 million for having 3 children, though these penalties no longer apply.
So-called excess births were dealt with mainly with contraceptives, which were available for all women. Failing that, a regime of fines, sterilization, intimidation, abortion, and infanticide comprised a sinister tool that China used to keep tight control over its population. These laws were enforced by family planning cadres in every region and every town. At 500,000 strong, they were one of the most extensive arms of state power and had significant power to enforce compliance and punish dissent relating to the one-child policy. Fines were the most common enforcement tool. Families faced a fine for every excess birth, and these were no measly penalties. For example, in Guangdong province, the fine for an excess birth was between 3 to 6 times the family's annual income. There were also rolling fines for non-compliance with other aspects of the one-child policy. Women with one child were fined every month that they did not have an IUD fitted and might face fines for missing their IUD checkups. In a society where almost everything was under the control of the state, penalties could come in other forms too. Families with excess children saw their electricity and water bills raised, their grain rations withheld, and licenses for driving or running a business revoked. They could also have their wages garnished on top of any fines that were imposed, and it was standing policy to fire any government or party employee who had unauthorized children. Collective punishment put social pressure on people to comply. A letter received by a Chinese couple from September 1987 shows how this was done. The couple were receiving training in America at the time, but were expected to return to China soon when the wife became pregnant with an unauthorized child. When her factory's population control office heard about this, they sent them a stern warning. Their irresponsibility meant that the factory would not receive any bonuses that year, and the benefits of all workers were at risk. They wrote, "The consequences for you are unthinkable. You would be condemned by all the staff and line employees of the factory. You should seriously reflect on these consequences and come to a speedy decision to fix your problem any way you can. Return to China immediately for an abortion." On the face, these punishments were a discouragement to anyone thinking of violating the one-child policy, but they had a more sinister side. A family that couldn't pay for food or water, who lost their jobs and were denied their grain ration, well, if they did have too many children, this was one way to bring that number down. The strict quotas for compliance that were imposed on family planning cadres led some of them to pursue intimidation tactics. In 1997, the Chinese Daily News reported that family planning cadres were burning the homes of excess child families in rural areas to scare them into submitting to sterilization or abortion. One member of these cadres recalled her experience in vivid detail. "Some of the people we are trying to control want to escape from us. Occasionally, the whole family disappears. They go off to another region. Then we burn their house. The first time I went to a village, I was very shocked by the violent behavior of my colleagues. They shot at people and threatened them with truncheons. But now I'm used to it. It is necessary for the enforcement of the rules. There are too many people in China." Many local authorities operated detention centres where violators of the one-child policy or their families might end up. Detained mothers could be forced to submit to sterilisation or abortion. More on that in a moment, or their family members could be used as leverage to make them comply. A consistent requirement of the one-child regime was that one partner in all couples who had 2 children had to be sterilised. In at least 80% of cases, this would be the woman. Whether they had ignored the earlier contraception demands or if their IUD failed, it didn't matter. In some areas, like Xinjiang municipality, women who simply missed their IUD checkups were to be sterilised without exception. Local cadres were given sterilisation quotas and were punished if they weren't met. The government officially claimed that they never forced anyone to be sterilised, but the quotas are just one piece of evidence debunking this. The fines also had the effect of driving people to sterilisation out of fear of financial ruin. After all, a choice between a fine and being sterilised is no real choice at all. Human rights groups in Tibet also observed doctors performing sterilisation on women while they were in for unrelated medical procedures. Doctors didn't need anyone's consent to perform the procedure, and many women awoke from an unrelated surgery to find it had been performed while they were under anaesthesia. The scale of these sterilizations was astronomical. Between 1979 and 1998, an estimated 146 million people were sterilized in China, the vast majority of them being women. Of the 250 million Chinese women of childbearing age in 2000, 85.3 million had been sterilized. Despite their efforts, contraception and sterilization could not prevent every pregnancy. The next step was abortion. China's one-child policy led it to have some of the most permissive abortion policies in the world. China's Ministry of Health still allows for abortion up to 24 weeks, double the time limit that was laid down in America's famous Roe v. Wade case. A particularly famous case occurred in 2012 when Feng Jianmei, a Shaanxi woman who could not afford to pay the fine for a second child, was held down and forcibly injected with a drug to abort her 7-month-old fetus. The story gained global media attention and inspired fierce criticism of the one-child policy. But the unfortunate reality is that Feng was just one of millions. Fines, intimidation, and outright medical deception forced countless of mothers into abortion they didn't want. In cases like Feng's, these children could have been viable outside of the womb when the procedure was performed. One woman named Zhu told her story of how she became pregnant with a second son in early 1981. When authorities found out, they forced her to have an abortion. Although she wanted her child, Zhu eventually submitted to the procedure. However, the abortion failed and Zhu's son was born alive on August 12, 1981. She was relieved and begged to have her son, but the hospital staff refused. Zhu was sent away and her son was euthanized. Probably the most disturbing story we encountered came from Dong Taifeng of Zhejiang province. Dong's wife went into labor with an unauthorized pregnancy on October 19, 2002. Dong, his wife, his mother, and his mother-in-law rushed to the local hospital. At first, things seemed well. The labor was progressing as planned, and the nurses confirmed that they could see the baby's head. Whatever joy Dong felt in that moment was shattered by the nurse's next question. "Where is your permission certificate?" Dong, of course, didn't have one. When he explained this to the nurse, she immediately excused herself to report to her superiors. Minutes later, a group of officials from the hospital's family planning office came into the room to interview Dong. Deception was the last thing on his mind, as his wife was going through labor, so he admitted to the officials that he had no permission certificate. He knew he'd have to pay a fine and possibly face other penalties, but that must have seemed like a small price to pay for the child he was moments away from meeting. But that was not the solution the family planning officials had in mind. A few moments later, hospital security entered the room and dragged Dong, his mother, and his mother-in-law into the corridor. Only then did Dong and his family realize what was happening. By the time Dong managed to break free and rush back to his wife's room, it was too late. What Dong saw is far too graphic for YouTube. Suffice it to say, the hospital staff ensured that there was one less excess child on their report. When the police showed up a few hours later, they weren't there for the hospital staff. Dong was reprimanded for making a scene and was bluntly told not to act foolishly again. Even the doctors had no sympathy for him. They explained that the Family Planning Commission had ultimate authority over births and that the medical staff were just following orders.
To enforce the law, women were forcefully sterilized and fined for having too many children. The problem is, it worked. Or something did. Historians doubt it prevented all 400 million births claimed by the government. But China's total fertility rate, the average number of children a woman will have in her lifetime, has fallen all the way to 1.6, well below the 2.1 needed to maintain its size. There simply aren't enough children. And in a few short years, China will begin to shrink.
China is hoping that 3 is a lucky number for families in the world's most populous nation. On Monday, the government announced it will allow couples to have up to 3 children instead of the current limit of 2. The shift in policy comes after census data showed a sharp decline in births, a low of 10 million last year compared to nearly 18 million in 2016.
The authorities in China have announced that couples will be allowed to have up to 3 children, raising the limit from 2. It follows census figures showing a steep decline in the birth rate. 5 years ago, the Chinese Communist Party had to abandon its one-child policy for the nation implemented in 1976, which aimed to limit population growth.
The announcement may have looked a little mundane, but the news was momentous. Chinese women can now have 3 children.
China has officially relaxed its family planning policy to allow couples to have 3 children. The policy shift was approved during a Politburo meeting chaired by President Xi Jinping. The move comes days after China's latest census results were declared. The recent census data found that China's birth rate was at its lowest since the 1960s. In fact, the country reported a record low of 12 million births in 2020, and it has been facing a shortage of young workers.
As thousands of children participate in festivities across China to celebrate the country's Children's Day, its leaders announced a policy shift encouraging families to have more of them. Chinese couples can now have up to 3 children. It comes just weeks after national census results pointed to the slowest population growth in decades. Beijing ended its decades-long one-child policy in 2016, raising the child limit to 2, but this failed to significantly boost the number of children being born. China's birth rate has fallen for the 4th year in a row. 12 million babies were born in 2020, short of government expectations. Chinese social media pages are full of comments about the new 3-child limit. Many are critical or ridicule the government's dramatic policy turnaround.
Welcome back. Well, experts say China's decision to allow couples to have up to 3 children may not actually do much to grow the younger population. They point to the high cost of living and education. But the government is pushing for a younger workforce to drive its booming economy.
China's gender balance has also been skewed by decades of the one-child policy.
Sex-selective abortions were a common occurrence. Male children were seen as more valuable than women in Chinese society, especially in rural areas where sons were needed to work the fields. Faced with the prospect of having a daughter, many couples chose to abort them and try again for a son. Sex-selective abortion is a major cause of China's continuing gender imbalance, where men significantly outnumber women. The problem became so severe that in 1986, the CCP made it illegal for parents to learn their child's sex before birth, and all sex-selective abortions were prohibited. Infanticide was a pervasive problem lurking in the shadows of Chinese society. Sex-selective infanticide against girls had been a common problem before 1949, but early communist China saw a sharp decline in the practice up until 1979. After 1979, it skyrocketed. Understandably, there are no clear records on how many children, mostly girls, were killed as infants thanks to the one-child policy. Scholars studying China's population have estimated that up to 50 million girls who should have been born since 1980, based on birth rate and the number of males, simply aren't there. Given that sex-selective abortion was banned, and allowing for some girls to slip through the registration, it's not hard to piece together what happened to them. Some were simply abandoned, left to starve or freeze to death where no one could find them. Willful neglect killed others. One study from 1994 showed that of all reported infant deaths, girls were significantly less likely to have been taken to hospital before they died. The implication being that parents didn't seek medical help for their girls and left them to die, while they did get help for boys.
Worse, the one-child policy, combined with a cultural preference for males, has created a massive gender imbalance. As a result, it's likely that by 2030, 1/4 of Chinese men in their late 30s will have never married. At a minimum, an abundance of forgotten young men will cause some social anxiety. Or possibly, as some experts suggest, serious conflict. It sounds a lot like the plot of a movie. Perhaps No Country for Young Men. Of course, China is aware of the problem, but it's fighting an inevitable demographic transition.
Although the policy has been relaxed in the last few years, this has not prompted a baby boom as policymakers had hoped. Falling marriage rates in recent years have played out in slower birth rates, as have rising costs of living and increasingly empowered and educated women delaying or avoiding childbirth. The demographic shift in China has significant economic and political implications for the world's second biggest economy. The world's most populous country had ended its controversial one-child policy to pave way for a two-child policy in the year 2015 for similar reasons.
China's one-child policy resulted in many female babies being aborted or abandoned in favour of male babies, and women were sterilised to prevent more pregnancies. So what is your reaction to this new policy that will allow 3 children per family, a policy reaction to China's ageing population and minimal growth?
Apparently, the general public response is very muted. In fact, there is a lot of wry comments on what is going on. Part of the reason is, again, for many people, the basic reason for the policy switch is because people did not have the babies when they permitted 2 children per family. So the question, therefore, is, would people want to have more children now that they are permitted to have 3 children per couple? Clearly, I think most people recognize that the policy is simply too late.
Beijing's one-child policy was in place for decades to slow the growth of China's population and reduce poverty. It was enforced with heavy fines and even forced abortions. But that strict policy relaxed a little bit 5 years ago, when the government allowed married couples to have 2 children. But even that failed to boost birth rates. Many couples say it's just too expensive to raise children in cities.
If there are better conditions, then we'd have more kids. Nowadays, young people have to buy a house. This amount of pressure is already huge. And then you have to consider the cost of the child's education.
大多数抚养孩子都是女生占的大多数，而且这个社会也没有给女生太多的体谅，所以就导致女生其实如果说男生能做的更多，或者家庭能给就是刚生育的女性更多的关怀的话，其实好多女生是可以生2胎的，因为毕竟还希望孩子有一个兄弟姐妹会好一点。但是再想想大环境，再想一下实际的，就不太想生2胎。3胎更不可能。
Chinese media says the policy will come with supportive measures, but few details are available for now. Experts say the extra benefits will be needed to convince people who are under increasing financial strain to make room for one more.
Unless the government introduces real incentives, I don't think that Chinese couples are going to have more kids in the coming years.
A trend that has Beijing worried and looks unlikely to change.
China's rising cost of living remains a barrier for families. Many are unable to afford having more than one child. Increasingly educated women are also putting off or foregoing having children altogether, largely because of workplace discrimination.
If the state really wants the birth rate, the crude birth rate to increase, it has to produce more welfare.
The government says it will delay the retirement age and offer support to families who have more children. But to avert a looming demographic crisis, some say it may be too little, too late.
China once estimated that its harsh controls had prevented 400 million births. But this is a change being driven not by a belated recognition of women's rights over their own fertility, but by economic need. The trouble is, few women want a second child, let alone a third. 2 is too exhausting, this woman says. We can't afford it, these women say. The government subsidies are not enough. This straw poll by China's official news agency says it all. Enthusiasm for a third child saw more than 1,000 votes. But those completely ruling it out, 28,000. The survey was deleted before it got any worse. And while the policy's being relaxed across most of the country, in Xinjiang there's evidence the controls are getting tougher, with a dramatic drop-off in Uyghur birth rates. A decline, China insists, that's entirely voluntary.
It should have been gone yesterday. The fact that it's still there in some form is a testament, I think, to the failures of Beijing to fully acknowledge the mistakes. You have a nation of really aging, lonely people who have been massively terrorized in a way by this very, very traumatic and at the end of the day, very unnecessary punitive family planning policy.
Giving birth was once the ultimate productivity hack. Before there were tractors, there were children. And then people stopped dying. It really only takes a few improvements to healthcare for rapid reductions in mortality. And that's how the world grew from 1.6 to 6.1 billion people in 1 century. That short window where fewer people are dying, but everyone's still having children. But it is just a window. After mortality drops, fertility is right behind it. As industrialization brings rural workers to find jobs in the city, children become less a utility and more a liability, the kind that screams and cries and generates student loan debt. The saying goes, the best contraceptive is economic development. The fact that countries like China, the US, Italy, and Germany have this problem is an otherwise good sign. Dangerously low fertility is actually a side effect of many good things: increased education, opportunities for women, and healthcare. It's a no-kidding first world problem. There are many ways to offset the damage. You can increase productivity, taxes, immigration, and/or fertility, but it's hard to find a solution that doesn't come with its own set of problems. Many countries, for example, now offer incentives for having children. One of the most generous is Sweden, where couples have the right to 480 days of paid maternity leave per child. The downside? Employers are more hesitant to hire young women, who are far more likely to take those days off. And it doesn't help that, even adjusted for inflation, the cost of raising a child has risen for decades. Babies just can't compete with dogs. China has already gone from issuing fines for second children to issuing checks, but people just don't seem to want them. This paper predicts the new two-child policy will only increase China's population from 1.4 to 1.45 billion in 2029. Because a person's ideal family size is largely determined by their own, 2 generations of Chinese now see 1 child as the norm. Plus, young people are pressured to work longer and harder to keep up with the rising taxes needed to support the older population. None of this means China can't come up with a solution. In fact, it has a few things going for it. As people move to the city, they'll become bigger contributors to the economy. And today's young workers are far better educated than those they're replacing. 11 years of schooling compared to just 6. There's also the bigger trend towards an automation-based economy, which doesn't rely on a large number of workers. But that too has the potential for chaos. And even if it does manage to increase fertility, remember that demographic changes are slow. Children born today won't start contributing for at least 18 years.
And experts say the population in China is getting older. With a smaller number of people in the workforce, the country's economic future could be at risk. Some residents say the changes came too late for them.
I think the country should have published this policy earlier. Couples like us have missed the time that we could have another child.
There has also been concerns over an aging population in China, and according to a recent estimate, 33% of the Chinese population will be above the age of 60 years by the year 2050. This could prove to be detrimental for the world's second largest economy, which depends on its workforce. A largely elderly population would also increase the burden on state welfare services.
You may have heard about China's demographic problems. Its population has declined for the past 2 years, and the country's high ratio of elderly to youth is going to be a burden for future generations, requiring even more spending down the road. That, and fewer births, imperils future economic growth, which means that the long-term outlook for China isn't as bright as it once was.
China doesn't have enough young people to sustain its economy, and the two-child policy brought in 5 years ago has made little difference.
The workforce is also rapidly shrinking, with roughly 20% of people now over the age of 60, and analysts say this could harm China's economic growth.
This will lead to the Chinese economy losing its vitality. There's an aging problem which threatens not only China's economy, but its defense and foreign policy. Previously, the Chinese government predicted the economy would be double in 2035 compared with 2020, but that would be mission impossible now.
No country has yet figured out how to manufacture 18-year-olds, not even China. And that means population today is a good peek at population tomorrow. When this information is combined with geopolitics or economics, it goes from mildly interesting to downright powerful. Here's what we know about China. Each of these lines is one of its age groups, with babies at the bottom and elderly at the top. First are consumers. From 18 to 45, we know people are spending. They're going to school, taking out loans, saving, not so much. And despite what this group says about millennials, they're very important because consumer spending is one of the biggest contributors to economic growth. Next are the moneymakers. These people have paid off their debt. Now they're saving for retirement. And even though they're a smaller share of the population, they generate most of its income. In the US, for example, they alone pay half of all income tax. That makes them a government's best friend. Finally, at age 65, people are done working, done saving, and largely done spending. What's special about this group is how quickly and how dramatically it begins. In a single day, a retiree often goes from contributing the highest taxes of their lifetime to almost nothing, as they slowly collect pensions and social security. For right now, let's ignore the total number of people. China could be bigger like this, or smaller like this. What's important is the balance between these different groups. And that's why this graphic is so useful. It's called a population pyramid because for most of history it has been a constant stream of babies at the bottom and a small number of deaths with each subsequent year. A good example is Niger, where the average woman has 6.5 children. Mortality is very high, making the average age only 15. But much of the world no longer looks like a pyramid. In China, it's turning upside down. As you can see, there are two big bulges in its population, here and here. The first is currently in its peak spending years. The second, right in the prime of its high-earning, high-tax contributing years. It's no wonder China is seeing massive economic growth. But that's what makes a demographic crisis such an ugly one. It happens very slowly, and then all at once. Remember, this huge group of workers will soon and quite suddenly retire as they start waiting for the checks to arrive. But the group responsible for writing those checks, or at least funding them, is getting smaller and smaller. The problem isn't just financial. A single child must now care for 2 parents and 4 grandparents. The United Nations expects China's dependency ratio, the number of non-working compared to working-age people, to increase at roughly the same rate as Japan's, whose population began shrinking in 2011, and now sells more adult diapers than infant ones. By 2050, China may have more retirees than all of Germany, Japan, France, and Britain.